They arrested the wrong man. Two words that echo like a stifled scream in the cold walls of justice, a whisper that, when uttered, threatens to destroy everything that seemed definitive, incontestable. It is a confession that has no place in calm courts or in hasty headlines. It is the voice of error, of human failure, of the system that stumbles over its own certainties. Imagine being arrested, convicted, and hearing someone say that the crime you paid for was not committed by you. That behind that cell, there is an innocent man being consumed by darkness. The confession came like a silent earthquake. It changed a man's destiny forever, but it also opened deep wounds in what should have been the search for truth. This story begins with a brutal crime, the kind that shatters the life of an entire city. A night marked by violence and death, evidence that pointed to a clear culprit, a man with a past, a face that was easy to identify. The police, under pressure, needed to close the case. And they closed it. Too quickly, too intensely, blindfolded, to details that didn't add up. The man in prison carried an invisible burden. Stories of abandonment, addictions that corroded his soul, scars that no one wanted to see. For many, he was an easy target. Someone with little voice, little support. The system turned him into a guilty party, a disposable cog in the machinery of justice. But what happens when the truth hides in the shadows? When certainties begin to crumble, one by one? The confession that emerges from the silence of prison is not just a plea for justice. It is a cry for help, a bomb ready to explode. You arrested the wrong man. These words cut through the darkness of the cell like a bolt of lightning. They don't just loosen chains. They shake the confidence of everyone who believed in the final verdict. What no one expected was the tsunami of doubts that this confession would bring. Witnesses who contradict each other, evidence that disappears, versions that change. Can you imagine the anguish of that man, isolated, knowing that the real culprit still walks free? The pain that permeates every night, every thought, every sigh. It is not just a question of freedom. It is a fight against silence, against the invisibility imposed by prison. And while the system tries to defend itself, trying to maintain the facade of order and justice, man remains trapped in the shadow of error. The final confession does not erase the lost years, nor recover the stolen moments. It merely throws a broken mirror in the face of the system, reflecting a fragmented and uncomfortable truth. Now the case reopens wounds that seem to have healed. Lawyers, journalists, and family members pore over the files, searching for what was left behind. Every overlooked detail, every piece of evidence that was ignored, is shed new light. But the question that no one can answer is, why did this happen? How could such a brutal mistake go unnoticed for so long? Is it a flawed system, an ingrained prejudice, or a dark game of interests that preferred to condemn an innocent person to maintain the illusion of control? This video will take you into this dark labyrinth. Follow every step, every secret that came to light after this fatal confession. Because this is not just a crime story. It is a story of pain, of error, of injustice, and perhaps of hope that still struggles to breathe. Stay with me, because what comes after this confession is even more disturbing. Don't miss it. The city was never the same after that night. A crime so brutal, so shocking that it took everyone's breath away, and became headline news in newspapers, on the radio, in police corridors. A bloody mystery that seemed impossible to ignore, a scene marked by violence, fear, and a truth that seemed to sink its blade into the chest of every citizen. The kind of crime that tears apart routines, destroys families, and leaves deep scars on the soul of an entire community. On that fateful day, a simple house in a forgotten neighborhood was the scene of the unthinkable. Walls stained red, traces scattered like a macabre map of what happened. The silence of the early morning was interrupted by muffled screams and hurried footsteps that disappeared into the shadows. The scene was so chaotic that even the crime scene experts were stunned. Everything pointed to a crime of passion or cruel revenge, but the pieces of that puzzle did not fit together perfectly. There was blood, a lot of it. And not just the victim's blood, but also marks that seemed to suggest a desperate struggle, a fierce resistance against the inevitable. Broken objects, overturned furniture, every detail screamed a story of horror and despair. The victim, an ordinary person, whose life and dreams had been destroyed in minutes, had been transformed into a statistic, a number in a case that needed to be solved all too quickly. But haste is often the worst enemy of the truth. The police, pressured by a society thirsting for answers, focused on a single line of investigation. They were blind to other possibilities, to contradictory witnesses, to small details that didn't make sense. The target was a man with a dark past, someone the city was already judging before the trial even began. And so, a system that should protect the truth turned a blind eye to what it didn't want to see. At that moment, the search for justice turned into a blind hunt for a culprit. It was easier to arrest someone than to admit that the truth could be much more hidden, much more painful. The media also contributed to this scenario, creating a narrative ready to be accepted, to feed fear and the desire for punishment. Social pressure turned the case into a race against time, a race in which the error was already beginning to be written. But what exactly led to the wrongful conviction? Was it simply the weight of the accused's past? Or was there a serious flaw behind the scenes in the investigation? The hidden truth in that crime was not only in the blood spilled, but in the hasty decisions made, in the closed-mindedness that did not tolerate doubts or hesitations. In the eagerness for a quick outcome, the system missed the chance to truly seek justice, and a man's life was destroyed because of it. And that is precisely where the complexity of the case comes in. Because amidst the horror of that crime scene, there is a transformation, a painful journey that involves not only the victim, but also the accused, society, and the judicial system itself. Every decision made at that moment has a direct impact on the lives involved, often without anyone noticing immediately. The behind the scenes of this investigation reveals a harsh reality where interests, prejudices, and even human errors are mixed together. The evidence, which seemed irrefutable, was actually the beginning of an even greater enigma. Important details were left out. Witnesses who could have turned the tide were silenced or discredited. A strange silence formed around all of this, as if a shadow were hiding the truth. Now I want to delve even deeper into this, because what happened that night, and in the hours that followed, cannot be seen solely through the lens of the crime. It is necessary to understand the psychology behind the decisions, the mindset that led to the conviction, the strength of the emotions that blinded those who should only seek the truth. This story is not just about a miscarriage of justice. It is about human fragility in the face of fear, pain, and the urgent need for answers. The confession that would later become the trigger for reopening the case gained even more weight. When analyzed from this perspective, a man who perhaps carried an invisible burden, fighting against his own demons, against loneliness and abandonment, and who, on his last night, revealed a truth that changed everything. What seemed closed, definitive and incontestable began to be questioned in the silence of the cells, in the dark corridors of the courts, at the desks of journalists who did not give up searching for what was hidden. Every fragment of that crime scene, every drop of blood, every broken piece of that macabre puzzle began to be examined with different eyes, because when the confession that you arrested the wrong man came to light, nothing could be seen in the same way again. The impact was profound, reverberating not only in the case, but in the very idea of what justice means. This confession is an open door to a hidden truth, to revelations that have yet to be uncovered, an invitation to question, to look beyond the obvious, to understand that justice is not always blind. Sometimes it just chooses what it wants to see. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. If you feel this story is more than just a crime, it's a mirror that reflects our own doubts about truth and justice. This confession is not just a fragment lost in time. It is a cry that echoes beyond the prison walls, an invitation to all who seek to understand the dark nuances of justice and truth. And that is why this story needs to be followed closely, because it does not end in the cell or in the courtroom. It lives on, pulsing in the air, ready to be unraveled step by step, detail by detail. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what touched you most in this search for the truth that is not content with easy answers. Your participation here is what transforms this conversation into a network, where each voice helps to strengthen the channel and bring this type of content to more people who, like you, do not accept half-truths. It is in this space that we build something bigger than a simple video. We create a community that refuses to close its eyes to the shadows, that wants to go beyond what the surface shows. Your presence, your comment, and even your like have real weight in this journey. They are the fuel to continue revealing stories that the system often tries to bury, but that deserve to be exposed. When you decide to sign up, you're not just clicking a button, you're saying you want to be part of those who seek to understand, question, and uncover what's hidden between the lines of the most disturbing cases. It's a silent but powerful commitment that keeps the flame of inquiry and critical thinking alive. This exchange is what makes the channel grow, reach more people, and maintain the quality and depth of the content you deserve. Without this support, many of these stories would remain forgotten, buried in the silence of the system. With it, they gain voice, body, and life. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. The figure everyone pointed to as the culprit seemed to fit perfectly into the portrait of the criminal. But, like every true story, the reality was much more complex than a simple police record or a sensationalist headline. This man, the accused, was not a stone monster. He carried within himself a tangle of pain and shadows, a past full of nuances that few dared to look at closely. From an early age, his life was marked by a series of painful decisions, the result of an environment that seemed to conspire against him. Childhood, far from being a refuge, proved to be a minefield of abandonment and silent traumas, those that slowly corrode the mind and soul. Addictions, which would later become inseparable companions, did not arise out of nowhere. They were desperate responses to invisible wounds. Loneliness, the eternal companion that haunted him, erecting impenetrable barriers between him and the world. But behind this raw and shattered image, there was a human being trying to survive amidst the chaos. Each wrong choice, each stumble, revealed not only a fall but also a silent cry for help that never came. His mind, shaped by experiences too hard to bear, became a labyrinth where the line between right and wrong blurred, where hope hid in dense shadows. It is this complexity that the system, so often hasty and ruthless, failed to see. Reducing it to an easy label was a fatal mistake, and paradoxically, it was this mistake that fueled the confession that would shake everything up. The confession that would show that the story we knew until then was only a distorted fraction of the truth. The weight of his past not only imprisoned him, but also created a narrative that blinded the eyes of those who should seek real justice. In an investigation filled with haste and prejudice, the evidence was interpreted through a distorted lens, and the collective fear of quick answers overshadowed the search for what really happened on that fateful night. This is the story of a man who was condemned not only for a crime, but also for the shadows he carried with him, for the decisions that fate imposed, and for the complexity of his own mind. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject because, to understand the impact of this confession, you have to delve into the backstage of a mind that suffered, that struggled, and that in the end, had its truth hidden by the cold surface of the system. This is a journey that challenges our mindsets about guilt, justice, and redemption. It is about the transformation that occurs when the truth begins to emerge from the cracks in the facade built around a conviction. When we begin to unravel the details of this dark personality, we find not only traces of a tortuous past, but also nuances that defy common sense and make us question, to what extent do the decisions we make, often under pressure and pain, shape our destiny? And who really wins or loses when justice bows to haste and the need for an easy culprit? This, man with his weaknesses and flaws, represents much more than the crime he was accused of. It is a mirror of human failings, of the devastating impact that loneliness and addiction can have on the mind, and of the hidden truth that only comes to light when we are willing to look beyond the surface. It's a story that invites us to reflect on what it really means to understand someone, and how the lack of that understanding can destroy lives. As the pieces of this puzzle are revealed, it becomes clear that the confession that changed everything did not come from a simple place. It emerged from a whirlwind of emotions, a mixture of guilt, relief, and perhaps a last attempt to show that the truth never completely disappears, no matter how hard we try to bury it. Comment below. I'm on this journey too, if you feel that these stories have the power to transform the way we see what's behind the headlines. The morning of that day did not announce the disaster that was to come. He woke up as always, carrying the invisible weight of a routine that already seemed to condemn him long before the final verdict. But what he didn't know, or perhaps sensed in some dark corner of his mind, was that that hearing would change everything. Not just your freedom, but the very essence of your existence. It was the breaking point where the system, hasty and relentless, would show its most cruel and merciless face. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was teeming with tension. The feeling was that decisions had already been made long before the words were spoken. Witnesses, evidence, and testimonies were presented at an almost suffocating speed, as if the true objective was simply to confirm what popular justice had already decreed on the streets and in the headlines. The man who carried a past stained by mistakes and pain, but still human, found himself facing a mechanism that cared little about his history or the hidden truth behind that fateful night. The judge, with a hard look and little room for doubt, seemed more interested in closing the case than in seeking the transformation that justice should promote. The prosecutor, determined to prove what was already considered obvious, rushed the process with a mentality that confused speed with effectiveness. And he, at the center of it all, felt the crushing weight of a flawed system that put speed above care, conviction above investigation. The hearing was a spectacle of hasty decisions. The evidence, some disconnected, some interpreted through the prism of fear and the need for answers, was used to paint an almost definitive picture. But what went unnoticed was the impact of this haste. The truth was slipping through the cracks, in the official narrative waiting for a chance to be revealed. At that moment, he was not just an accused. He was a symbol of the failures of a system that often imprisons more than bodies. It imprisons destinies, illusions, and the possibility of a new beginning. The imprisonment that followed was more than the closing of physical bars. It was the closing of doors to any hope of true justice. Life became a nightmare shaped by decisions that ignored nuances, by a mindset that prioritized immediate results, and by a trial that closed its eyes to the true wounds behind that crime. In the CU, cold dark cells, the transformation was inevitable. A man, once merely an accused, became a number, a case, a forgotten story within the walls that do not know how to listen. And while society demanded punishment, he faced his own internal battle, against abandonment, against stigma, against the loneliness that only the forgotten know. The truth, however, never completely disappeared. It fermented, hidden in the shadows, ready to emerge at the right time. This journey, marked by life-changing decisions, reveals the behind-the-scenes of a system that often fails to confuse haste with justice, appearance with truth. It is a harsh reminder of the impact this mindset can have, not only on the accused, but on all those who believe in a greater ideal of justice. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, to reveal how these hasty decisions have opened space for doubts that until then were drowned out by the noise of hasty judgment. How the transformation of a man, who could have been just a victim of the system, challenges us to look at the flaws that remain hidden in the shadows of justice. It is a reflection on what happens when the hidden truth tries to emerge amidst a scenario marked by interests, haste, and the urgent need to close chapters. Comment below. This makes sense to me. If you have ever felt that, behind decisions that seem definitive, there are stories that deserve to be listened to more carefully. After that hearing, the hunt began. Not the kind you see in movies with flashing lights and sirens in the distance, but a silent, cruel hunt where the truth gets lost in a maze of conflicting evidence and testimonies that contradict each other at every turn. The system that was supposed to protect, investigate, and guarantee justice seemed trapped in its own web. A web made of flaws, haste, and above all, interests that would never be exposed in public. It was the dirty game of the shadows, where reality became malleable and justice an increasingly distant concept. The official investigation took a turn that few would dare question. Evidence was collected, yes, but its weight seemed more like a burden placed on the shoulders of the accused than a path to the truth. The witnesses, essential figures in clarifying. The facts became pieces of a puzzle that never fit together. Their versions changed, sometimes subtly, other times drastically, creating a scenario of uncertainty and doubt. The labyrinth closed in, the walls grew thinner, and the man who was only looking for a chance to defend himself found himself increasingly trapped inside an invisible prison, built with words, suspicions, and disconnected fragments. The impact of this manhunt was devastating. It wasn't just about proving innocence or guilt, it was a fight for the survival of the man's very identity. The journey that began with a suspicious eye from the system turned into a duel where every step was watched, every movement contested, every word analyzed in search of a flaw that could confirm what many already wanted to believe. The dominant mentality in the investigation allowed no room for doubt, and this caused the truth to hide in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge, if that ever happened. Behind the scenes of this persecution, secrets were buried, revelations were suppressed, and the true meaning of justice was distorted. That man, previously seen as just one criminal among many, carried on his shoulders the weight of other people's decisions, of judicial haste, and of official versions that ignored the nuances, pain, and trauma that defined his trajectory. The Yao system seemed more interested in closing a case than in finding the transformation that a true investigation could bring. And so the manhunt became a dark mirror of what justice cannot, or does not want to, admit. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this is where the hidden truths begin to emerge. This is where the impact of hasty decisions and contradictions in the investigation begin to reverberate, creating a narrative that challenges the official version and invites us to question what really happened. The journey to understand this case in depth takes us beyond the evidence and testimonies, forces us to look behind the scenes, at the details that no one wants to reveal, at the flaws that sustain a system that is as flawed as it is cruel. This reflection is not just about a specific man or crime, it is about the weight of decisions that shape destinies, about the mentality that prevails in processes that should be guided by the search for truth, not by the rush to condemn. It is an invitation for us to see beyond the obvious, to question the official versions and to recognize the impact that a lack of care can have on someone's life, and on our own trust in a system that often fails when we need it most. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. If you feel that the truth is sometimes more complex than it seems, and that it deserves to be uncovered with courage, patience, and a careful eye. The courtroom seemed more like a stage than a space for justice to breathe. The cold walls, the jurors' weary gazes, the weight of the chairs, everything conspired to transform that moment into a somber rite, where the condemnation was already written between the lines. Long before the first verdict was pronounced, the accused entered that room not as a man seeking defense, but as someone who already carried the sentence of a fate sealed by haste and prejudice. It was as if the scales were rigged, tilted to a side that did not allow for balance, justice, or redemption. Every word the lawyers said, every glance the prosecutors gave, every testimony presented had the bitter taste of inevitability. No matter what was said, the feeling was that this trial was not a search for the truth, but a performance to justify what had already been decided behind the scenes, far from the public eye. The atmosphere became suffocating, filled with a heavy silence punctuated by sighs, furtive glances, and the dry sound of the gavel that would dictate the man's future. The mentality that permeated that court reflected a society in a hurry, ready to condemn before understanding. to judge before listening, to punish before investigating. It was the haste of the system that denied the necessary time for transformation, for reflection, for the revelation of nuances that could change the course of that story. The feeling of being before a monster ready to be defeated took over the environment, and the man, isolated in his solitude, saw his world collapse under the weight of a sentence that seemed more like a preliminary execution than a judgment. But the decisions made there had an impact far beyond that courtroom. They affected not only the lives of the accused, but also the collective mindset about justice, guilt, and redemption. That grim trial became a symbol of a system that often fails at its core, that gets lost in bureaucracy, prejudice, and haste, forgetting that behind every trial there is a life, a complex story, full of traumas, choices, and consequences that cannot be summarized in a simple sentence. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is at this point that the revelations begin to emerge, showing the behind the scenes of a process that should have been fair, but which, in practice, revealed flaws and contradictions that are difficult to ignore. The trial was not just an isolated event, but part of a journey marked by decisions that influenced the final outcome, shaped perceptions, and left deep marks, not only on the convicted, but on the very idea of justice that we uphold. When looking back at this episode, it is impossible not to reflect on the real impact that a flawed system can have on people's lives and the trust we place in it, the hidden truth behind the verdict, the decisions that seemed inevitable, and the silence that surrounded the defense make this story a warning about the need for change. This hasty mentality, this search for easy and definitive answers, shows that true judgment goes far beyond the sentence. It is a reflection of the choices we make as a society, the priorities we establish, and the courage we have to face the complexity of the truth. Comment below. This makes sense to me if you've ever felt that justice isn't always fair, and that the truth is often hidden, waiting to be revealed with patience and a critical eye. The silence inside the prison is not the same as the silence outside. It is heavier, dense. It has the weight of concrete and the smell of rust. It is not just the absence of noise, but the constant presence of thoughts that hammer without respite. Inside, time does not pass. It drags on like a wounded animal, bleeding memory by memory, minute by minute. When the cell closes and the lights go out, what is left is not darkness. It is confrontation. It is raw truth, without filters, without distractions. The man who enters this space carrying an unjust conviction does not enter only with handcuffs. He enters with scars that still bleed. It is at this point in the journey that a transformation begins that is invisible to the eyes of those looking from the outside. Because from the outside it is easy to point, judge, turn your back. But inside, where reality hits without anesthesia, the human being is pushed into himself. Isolation becomes a mirror, a dirty, distorted mirror, but impossible to ignore. The mind screams where the mouth is forced to remain silent. The days are all the same, but the thoughts are not. They accumulate, repeat, intensify, until one day, without warning, something inside breaks. The man who once believed he could defend himself begins to doubt even his own sanity. Because when justice makes a mistake, it doesn't just punish the innocent, it reorganizes his world. It distorts reality, identity, and the very idea of the future. Prison walls don't just imprison the body. They imprison possibilities, dreams, the ability to take a deep breath and believe there is a way out. The cell becomes a world. And within this world, everything is compressed. Time becomes an enemy. Hope becomes an addiction. In this scenario, the mind goes through stages. First comes denial, then comes revolt, and then emptiness. A silent abyss where there is no more room for anger, only exhaustion, only a kind of internal surrender. This is where many break. This is where many get lost. But it is also here that some rebuild themselves, far from the voices, far from the cameras, far from the eyes of the system. This is where man imprisons the version that the world condemned, and in the darkness begins, perhaps for the first time, to dig for his own truth. This reconstruction, however, does not come with relief. It comes with pain, with memories that come back like razors, with questions that no one answers, with a silent scream that echoes in the head night after night. Prison is not just a place. It is a state of mind, a psychological field where every past decision resurfaces like a ghost, and where every future step seems impossible. But in the midst of this internal chaos, flashes of lucidity emerge, fragments of consciousness that try to cling to what is left of humanity. It is at this point that the journey gains depth, because it is no longer about proving innocence or waiting for justice. It's about surviving your own mind, of finding a way to exist in a space that wants to erase your existence. Silence becomes a confidant. The ceiling of the cell becomes a confessor, and the days so similar become mirrors of an involuntary transformation. Every crack in the wall seems to reflect a crack within. The mind adapts, but never without cost. And the cost is sometimes identity itself. And while the world outside forgets, the truth continues to breathe inside. Silent, firm, like a secret buried under concrete, waiting for the right moment to emerge. With each knock on the iron door, with each step of the guard in the hallway, with each hour without a voice, man rebuilds himself little by little, not by choice, but by necessity. Because there, where no one is listening, he is forced to listen to everything. Every mistake from the past, every silence from the present, every hypothesis from the future. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what happens to the mind of someone who knows they have been thrown into a place where they shouldn't be? How does the outlook of a man change when he sees the truth being ignored? There is a kind of internal mutation that cannot be measured, but that shapes everything. Thoughts stop being logical. They become instinctive. Survival becomes a mantra. And in the midst of this, revelations emerge that no one expected. Revelations about the system itself, about the behind the scenes of the conviction, and mainly about the fragility of what we call justice. It is not just man who changes. The very idea of right and wrong begins to crumble within these walls. What seemed absolute becomes relative. What seemed like guilt becomes construction. It is in this environment where pain is constant and the lack of answers is the norm, that the mind begins to create invisible escape routes, some psychics, other symbolic, and some dangerously real, because the silence of prison can even seem harmless. But it is precisely in this silence that the biggest decisions are made. Write down, I'm on this journey too. If you've ever felt that silence can reveal more than 1,000 words, and that sometimes it's in isolation that the greatest transformations are born. The cell was darker than usual that night. It wasn't just the lack of light, it was the weight of waiting, as if each second stretched time, cracking the hours like fractured bones under pressure. Outside, the world spun indifferently. Inside, he felt everything stop. The cold wall, the rough mattress, the sound of the clock that didn't exist, but that he swore he heard inside his head. As if time had taken shape just to torture him a little more. A man's last night has no relief. There is no truce. There are no distractions. You have memories, and each one of them tears pieces off. He was thinking about his father, his mother's, face fading from memory like mist. I thought about the smell of rain when I was a child, the noise of the street where I played, the things I would never feel again. But he also thought about the lies he had swallowed, the wrong decisions that had turned his destiny into a corridor of no return. This wasn't just a wait for death. It was a wait for something deeper. Truth, perhaps, or just a little peace. But how do you find peace when the world is judging you for something you swear you didn't do? When your very identity has been ripped away and shaped by sensationalist headlines, by apathetic juries, by a system that chose to believe more convenient versions than reality? For years, he had been taught to keep quiet, to accept, to swallow his own pain and move on. But that night, something changed. As if the prison had dug so deep into his soul that at the bottom of the abyss he found courage. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't redemption. It was something raw. The visceral need to not die carrying the silence. The decision to speak out did not come from outside. It did not come from lawyers or priests or family pleas. It came from within. It was born from within like a primal instinct. He wanted to be heard. He wanted to leave something more than just his name on a medical record. He wanted the final words to be his. Not the newspapers, not the judges, his. But speaking wasn't easy. His mind was filled with voices, some real, others created by sleepless nights. He talked to the ceiling, to the wall, to God. But no one answered. And yet, that night, he knew he couldn't put it off any longer. Because there was a weight greater than death. The weight of leaving with a secret stuck in his throat. He asked for paper. He asked for time. And it was ignored. Again, the system was in no hurry. But he had. So he used his own skin as a record. He marked phrases with his fingernail on the wall. He scribbled with charcoal the pieces of his soul that still resisted. He wrote with everything he had, because it was all he had left. And in that simple, brutal, and urgent gesture, he began to reveal what he never had the courage to say. About the night of the crime. About who was with him. About the error that was never fixed. It wasn't a confession as expected. It was a reconstruction. A puzzle that he only now allowed himself to put together. The cell became the stage for a final silent act. And each word torn out was like a knife in the flesh. Because the truth sometimes hurts more than a lie. But it also liberates. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because there is something that few have the courage to face the true impact of a final confession. Not for those who listen, but for those who say. Because sometimes the truth costs too much and then comes too late. Right there. I'm on this journey too. In the cold room, with empty eyes and controlled breathing as if swallowing his own fate, he did not hesitate. His voice came out without tremor, without haste, only with the gravity of someone who knows he has nothing left to lose. You arrested the wrong man. The sentence fell to the floor like lead. It was not a shout. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, a whisper that exploded louder than any judgment. On the other side of the table, no one moved. For seconds, that felt like minutes. Time stood still. Their eyes met, but no one knew what to say. What do you do when someone, about to be executed, drops a hidden truth on the table that threatens to bring everything crashing down? No one was prepared to listen, but now it was too late to pretend he hadn't heard. The final confession didn't come with tears. It didn't come with theatrical repentance or pleas for forgiveness. It came like a sharp scalpel, precise, silent, lethal. He began to detail forgotten points, ignored contradictions, a name, a face, an address, fragments that had seemed unimportant before now fit together like a curse no one wanted to acknowledge. The impact was immediate, not because everyone believed it, but because deep down, they knew something was wrong from the beginning. You know that feeling you try to stifle? That voice that whispers in the dark that something doesn't make sense? That doubt muffled by protocols and stamped papers? It came back, and it came back screaming. The confession wasn't just an accusation, it was an implosion, a grenade thrown into the heart of the case. He wasn't seeking mercy, he was offering one last chance for someone, somewhere, to do the right thing. Because he knew that after that, nothing else would matter to him. But for those who heard it, everything would change. And it was at this point that the masks began to fall. The prosecutor looked away. The federal agent clenched his jaw. The chaplain, who had been muttering automatic prayers until then, stopped praying. Tension filled the room like smoke, dense, toxic, unbreathable. For the first time in years, silence was no longer a shelter. It was an enemy. His words echoed inside. They stirred what each person wanted to keep buried. Because when the truth escapes, it doesn't come back, it runs. It infiltrates, it corrodes, and forces everyone to face what they would rather leave in the shadows. He began to tell everything. Names omitted in the trial, witnesses ignored, political pressure. Behind the scenes of an investigation that did not want justice, it wanted a quick conclusion. The kind of revelation that turns into a scandal if someone has the courage to expose it. But no one there seemed ready for that. Because a truth like that does not redeem, it compromises. And compromise in this world costs too much. Still, he continued, like someone who opens their own wound to show that it's not just pain, it's proof. Like someone who knows that if they don't tell now, they'll take with them what could change everything. And the way he spoke, it wasn't like someone who had rehearsed. It was from someone who lived every detail, of those who carry marks that do not appear in the court photos. His last confession was not about him. It was about an entire system, about a cycle that repeats itself because no one dares to stop it. He did not ask to be saved. He asked to at least be listened to. Because when someone dies carrying the guilt of another, it is not only he who dies, it is the idea of justice. But there was still something left unsaid, something he held on to like a final letter. And all you had to do was look into his eyes, and you could tell that what was coming next wasn't just a detail. It was the missing piece, the one that could no longer be ignored. He wasn't just revealing a mistake. He was pointing out a direction, a path that, if followed, would open up a new investigation or ruin everything once and for all. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what he said after that was what really shook the ground, not just among those present, but among everyone who once believed that truth was a straight line and not a dark maze full of broken mirrors. Comment there. That makes sense to me. The room remained silent for long seconds after those words, a silence that was no longer one of respect. It was one of denial. The confession hung in the air like a thick fog, too heavy to ignore, but too uncomfortable to face head on. And when he finished speaking, there was no relief, only tension. No one stood up. No one said, "Let's investigate," because everyone there understood the weight of that, but didn't want to carry it. And what happened next was not what you'd expect from a fair system. There were no headlines. There was no reopening of the case. The name, he said, was ignored. The new trail of evidence was shelved, as if nothing had been said, as if it was all the delirium of a man trying to escape his destiny. But the truth is that what he revealed was simply too inconvenient, a real threat to structures that cannot withstand cracks. Justice is not blind. It only closes its eyes when it suits it. In the official report, the final confession was not even mentioned. Witnesses in the room signed confidentiality documents. The content of the conversation vanished like smoke, and he was taken as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't left a bomb ready to explode in the heart of truth. The system preferred to bury everything, because it was easier to erase a man than to redo the entire past. But the shadow of that confession did not die with him. It continued to haunt the prison corridors, haunting the minds of those who listened, infiltrating whispered conversations between guards, prosecutors, even priests. Because a truth buried alive screams louder than any sentence. It eats away at you from within. It rots trust. And over time it begins to bleed through the cracks. The name he revealed, and which remains off the record to this day, was that of someone with connections, a man with a shady past and friends in the right place. He was not in prison. He never was. While the condemned man awaited execution, the true author of the tragedy remained free, untouchable, protected by the machines that prefer silence to exposure. And here is the cruelest point of this story. The system heard the truth and chose to ignore it. It makes you wonder, how many confessions have been suppressed? How many truths have been destroyed before they even had a chance to breathe? His wasn't the only confession. It was just one of the few that escaped. And yet, it was stifled, not by time, but by convenience, by institutionalized cowardice that would rather maintain a functional lie than make room for real transformation. The mentality behind this is rotten. The logic is simple. If we reopen this case, we will open the door to many others. And that is frightening, because any system based on appearances cannot support in-depth investigation. It crumbles when exposed to light. That is why they keep the curtains closed, the backstage hidden, the decisions buried under tons of bureaucracy and omission. But there's always someone paying attention, and as the years went by, some pieces started to move. People who were in that room began to suffer nightmares, crises. One of them, years later, left the prosecutor's office and wrote a book, which was never published. But it circulates in PDF format among journalists who still believe that truth should not be optional. There he describes that moment in detail, the voice of the condemned, the reaction of those present, and the collective decision to silence everything. In the final chapter he writes, "What I saw in that room destroyed me inside, because it wasn't the mistake that scared me the most. It was the silence after it. This is not just about a man unjustly executed. It is about how truth can be murdered just as coldly, just as indifferently, and sometimes just as technically." Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what comes next is not just a consequence. This is the part where the ghosts of this story start, knocking on the door of those who tried to hide them. When the past refuses to die, it begins to take its toll, and the consequences are not silent. Write it down. I'm on that journey too. If this story has touched you, it's because at some point it touched something deep inside you. Maybe a memory, an old doubt, or just that nagging feeling that there's something very wrong with the way things work. And if you've come this far, it's because this journey has captivated you, the same way it captivates those who dare to face the truth head on. So if this type of content makes you think, makes you feel, if it gives you more than just a story but also a new way of seeing the world, subscribe to the channel, because what we bring here goes beyond the surface. It's for those who aren't content with the obvious. And comment there, "I'm with you until the end." Because whoever feels the weight of this story until the last second deserves to be heard too. Oh, and leave a like. Not out of habit, but because this connection between us matters. And this gesture shows that it's worth continuing to open up these wounds, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. There is a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there, because what comes after this is even more disturbing. Don't miss it.